Good afternoon to those of you here in the chapel, as well as out in Zoom land, as I like to call it. We are on day 3 of our study of Samuel and the law of E.F. Hutton. Now, I'm sure by now, the last couple of days, if you've been with us, you've been refreshed in your mind about E.F. Hutton and the commercials and all of that. Through the commercials anyway, the message they were communicating about influence and the fact that E.F. Hutton was a person, at least according to those commercials, that when he spoke, people listened. And so I'm excited about today's lesson. I think it's will be very helpful and insightful. So we'll jump right in because there's a lot to go over. Again, the law of E.F. Hutton, just like the commercial, when the real leader speaks, people listen. And I think we could really go beyond that to a certain degree and say when the real leader speaks, people want to listen. People will want to hear what that individual has to say. And sometimes they won't even make a decision until that person has weighed in. So when the real leader speaks, people will in fact listen. So our leadership thought for today will kind of fuse our emphasis this week with our emphasis a few weeks ago on influence. Because our leadership thought for today says the impact of the voice is determined by the influence of the leader. Doesn't that just kind of make common sense that the more influence a person has, the more likely their voice will be sought out, let alone heeded? And of course, we'll find that applies most assuredly, not just for E.F. Hutton, but for our biblical version of E.F. Hutton, otherwise known as Samuel. So I'll start with this verse from Proverbs. It's a great little verse. It says, "The lips of the righteous feed many." So just take a moment and reflect on that. The lips, or in other words, of course, referring to the words that someone would speak of a righteous person is like food. It feeds many people. And we maybe call to mind when Jesus fed the 5,000, that even Jesus' words were life-giving. And I like that statement, so succinct. The lips of the righteous feed many. May we be people whose words feed people, lift them up, encourage them, not tear them down. And so by way of introduction today, John Maxwell asked on page 72 of his book, The 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day. He says, what is the greatest measure of an E.F. Hutton? The answer is the ability, now get this, to lead other leaders. He says that's the toughest job any leader has, because most leaders don't want to be led, right? They want to go their own way. That's partly what induced them or motivated them to want to become a leader in the first place. So they want to go their own way rather than fall in line behind another leader. So when we go back into the story of Samuel, we recognize that Samuel exemplifies this principle of a leader of leaders. In other words, he was the leader of Israel's leaders, which included nobles, elders, and most significantly, of course, of kings, Saul and then David for a brief time. So the question here is, what made people want to listen to Samuel? What motivated them? What was it about Samuel? And even more so, that continued unabated even after he gave up the civil and the military authority to Saul, yet people, including Saul, still wanted to hear from Samuel. Why was that? Well, there are 5 things that we'll talk about today. People listened to Samuel, one, because he was secure in his calling. Secondly, Samuel was willing to share his authority. Third, Samuel desired to help others develop their potential. Fourth, Samuel spoke the truth into people's lives. And fifth, and finally, Samuel had a heart for people, for both God and for people. So again, Samuel had a heart for God and for people. So let's take some time and unpack these 5 points. I'm sure many of us can probably relate to working with or for an insecure leader. It's a very, very tough situation to be in because insecure leaders usually are very territorial. They don't want to be challenged. They don't want to be provoked to go beyond their comfort zones. They kind of just like being in their position and have everyone kind of just be yes people. That's an insecure leader. But Samuel did not experience a reduced level of confidence or security in his calling, even when Saul was anointed as king. In fact, though Samuel appointed and anointed Saul, he never allowed Saul to intimidate him, but rather continued to exercise authority over him. Now, go back to week 1. What were some of Saul's attributes? Do you remember? He was taller, a head taller than everybody, most handsome person in Israel. We talked about in week 1 how if Saul would have been like a high school, a kid in high school, he'd have been the quarterback of the football team and the homecoming king and all of this. In other words, Saul had everything going for him. And he was a unanimous selection as king. All the people said, yes, this is the one we want. And yet, Samuel continued to exercise authority over Saul, even though Saul was now the civil and military leader. This reminds me of an example in the New Testament of John the Baptist. John the Baptist had an amazing ministry, and lots of good things were happening, and crowds were really, really big, everyone coming out to him. But he makes an amazing statement, John the Baptist does, when Jesus comes by. He says that he, referring to Jesus, must increase while I must decrease. In other words, John was very secure in his calling. He knew what he was called to do. He knew what he was not called to do, and he just rested in that calling. Samuel likewise was secure in his calling. And so that's something that all of us should aspire to be secure in what we're called to. So let's move on. Not only was Samuel secure in his calling, but he was also willing to share his authority. Again, something that an insecure leader won't do. But he was willing, based from that basis that we just talked about in terms of his security, out of that, then he was willing to share his authority. Because up until the time that Saul was anointed by Samuel, Samuel had basically universal control. He was, as we spoke about yesterday, he was in essence the prophet, the priest, and the king all rolled up into one. But then God says, do what the people ask, give them a king. And so then in anointing and appointing Saul as king, Samuel then turned over both the civil and the military control as God directed him to do so. Now, beyond that, Samuel always honored Saul publicly. Because think what it would have been like if Samuel, who, although not having the title any longer, but still being recognized as the authority, if he had gone behind Saul's back or undermined him in any way, both Samuel and Saul's credibility would have been diminished. But instead, Samuel always honored Saul publicly, one time, in fact, early on, he reserved a special place at his table and had a very special menu just for Saul. And then another time, and this is even more profound because this is after Saul had sinned by offering a sacrifice that he wasn't authorized to do. And then Samuel says, your kingdom is going to be torn away from you because you've sinned. And Saul acknowledged that, but then he says, will you go with me? Because Samuel said, I'm not going with you to this big feast. I'm not going. But Saul begged him to, for the exact reason that he didn't want to lose face in front of the people. And so Samuel decided to go ahead and go so that he could save face with the people. Now, I love this statement that Coach Bill McCartney, who became the leader, really the creator of the Promise Keeper movement, he says, we are not here to compete with each other, but to complete each other. Oh, I sure wish that more people had that mindset right there, that we don't compete so much as complete. Boy, those words sound a lot. They sound alike, don't they? But boy, how different they are in their meaning. So we're here to complete, not compete. All right, moving on to our next point. Samuel desired to help others develop their potential. Again, thinking about Samuel's relationship with Saul, and especially at the beginning. You know, if Samuel was less secure in his own calling, he undoubtedly would have undermined Saul in any way that he could in order to retain what he already had. But Samuel, although he was displeased at Israel's request to even want a king, nevertheless, he never undermined the new king. Instead, what did Samuel do? He gave advice to the people. He said, this is what it's going to be like when you have a king. But then he also gave advice to Saul as to how he should proceed. He goes on later to remind Saul that God was with him. So even though the people had disobeyed in asking for a king, when God determined that Saul was to be that king, Samuel was the one to remind him, God is with you. Because especially in those early days, and remember when Saul was named as king and they had this big celebration, they had to go find Saul in the baggage. So he wasn't this prideful, insecure person that he later became, but initially he was very humble. And in that regard, Samuel saw an immense amount of potential in Saul at that early stage in terms of his potential to be a spiritual leader. And Samuel did everything he could to encourage that in Saul and to help him develop that. That's why it's so important that as leaders, one of the best things that we can do for people is to see the potential that they have and to encourage it and to develop it, to add value to them. So very, very important. Next, and how important this one is, Samuel spoke the truth into people's lives. Jesus goes on later, much later in John chapter 8, to declare the truth will set you free. So the truth is always good. Now, sometimes it's painful, that's true, but it's always good. So even as a young boy, go back to our first lesson this week. Here is Samuel, he got his first word from the Lord. He's laying in the other room where Eli was, who was the priest, the high priest, and God gives this young boy a message that God is going to basically destroy the house of Eli and his sons. And Eli goes to Samuel, who now is a young boy, he might have been 8, 9, 10 years old, and says, you got to tell me every last word. Don't leave anything out. Would you have sympathized just a little bit with Samuel if he had maybe fudged it just a little? You know, if he'd maybe said, well, God says you better mend your ways or else. Would we have found fault with the young Samuel if he had done that? Probably not. We'd probably been understanding and probably tempted ourselves to do the very same thing. But in fact, Samuel told Eli exactly, not leaving anything out, what was going to happen. And Eli basically says, well, whatever the Lord thinks is all right with me. So he started at a very young age speaking the truth. He told the people that they had acted foolishly in demanding a king. They might have stoned him. They might have rejected or rebelled against him, because in essence, that's what they were doing. In fact, Samuel, the reason why Samuel was so upset with them is not so much that they were rebelling against him, but he said, you're rebelling against God. And so Samuel was acting in a sense as God's defense attorney, if you will. That's why he spoke the truth to him and said, you have acted foolishly in demanding a king. Of course, we know that a couple of different occasions, he rebuked Saul, once because he offered a sacrifice that he wasn't authorized to offer. And then on another occasion, God sent him out on a specific mission to destroy the Amalekites, and he wouldn't do it. They brought in the king of the Amalekites when they captured him, and Saul was supposed to kill him. He wouldn't do it. So guess what Samuel did? He did what Saul should have done. And so Samuel never spoke out of either spite or a spirit of superiority. But, and the balance is, he never backed away from the truth. Isn't that just a great balance that we want to keep in our own lives? We don't want to speak the truth because we're supposed to speak the truth, what? In love. Not to tear down, but to lift up. So Samuel never spoke out of spite or superiority, but he never backed away from telling the truth. That's good stuff. Finally, and I don't know if this is most important, but it's certainly very important, Samuel had a heart for both God and people. You know, some time ago, I was reviewing the Great Commandment in Matthew 22, verse 37. And you probably are familiar with that. A lawyer had asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? We believe in the context of that, it was kind of like a trick question, but Jesus didn't really take it as such. So he immediately, without hesitation, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. If you've done these, Jesus says, in essence, you've kept all the commandments. And it really is interesting. If you look at the 10 commandments, you really can boil them down to 4 words. Love God, love people. So we even kind of cheated a little bit because we took one word and used it twice. So love God, love people, you keep the commands of God. Samuel had a heart for both God and people. He was committed to bringing out the best in people and sharing with them how they could experience God's blessing. If there would have been such a thing as a mission statement back then, you know, mission statement, everyone's got to have one now. Personal mission statement, corporate mission statement, got to have a mission statement. If Samuel had had a mission statement, I'm sure this would have captured the essence of it, that he wants to bring out the best in people and enable them to experience the blessing of God. This desire for the best for people extended even to Saul, who could have been his enemy, who replaced Samuel as a civil and military leader. And then even as Samuel had declared to Saul that God would replace him as king, get this, Samuel still mourned for him. He was still sorrowful. Not glad, not, oh, you know, see, my words were vindicated. No, he mourned for Saul. And so by way of conclusion, because our time is nearly gone, ultimately the leaders that people listen to most carefully and really get this, they are the ones who have their people's best interest in mind, not their own. That's what it takes to become an E.F. Hutton. And so that brings us to our conclusion. with our question for today. Why should people listen to you? Hint, it's in the last slide, the previous slide. So with that, we just, again, encourage you to come back tomorrow, 3:30, and we'll do then session 4 of the Law of E.F. Hutton. God bless you. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.